Okay, today we're going to be looking at tying the woolly bugger. First thing we're going to do is kick off with starting your thread. So we want to use an olive coloured thread today, so we'll just fix the thread in, wrap it in touching wraps back towards the bend of the hook, roughly to the length of the lead wire that you plan on tying in. So I'm wrapping it a good halfway through the length of the hook shank. The first piece of material we're going to attach into the fly is the lead wire. So we want to grab a section of lead wire, lie it along the hook shank, and then fix that into place using your thread. So we'll start at the front of the hook, move our way back towards the hook shank, capturing the lead wire up against the hook shank itself until you've wrapped far enough down the hook shank to support or capture in the lead wire length that you require. Then fix it in with a couple of wraps behind the lead wire, and then wrap back forward to the front of the hook shank again. At this point I like to try and adjust the lead wire so that it's sitting directly on top of the fly, so you can just give it a bit of a twist. At the front section I like to build up a bit of thread so that I sort of even out where the lead wire ends and the hook shank begins. Then back down the lead wire, another wrap or two behind the lead wire itself, and then I'll just break the lead wire off at that point. I like to try and smooth out the transition between the lead wire and the hook shank by building up a bit of thread at either end of the lead wire itself. It just gives your body a bit better appearance, and it does make it easier to manage the layering of the other materials that you're adding to the fly later on in the woolly bugger build. Okay, we're now at the point where we tie in the marabou tail. So you'll need to find your olive marabou feather, pull a feather out, try and find a nice fluffy one. Take that feather and rather than just tying it straight in, I like to pull the prongs off, so I'll pare them back a bit, straighten them out, and then grab a couple of sections of the marabou feather and pull it away from the actual feather barb itself. I then put both of those pieces together and align the ends so that you end up with a nice fluffy piece of feather that's going to form the tail of the woolly bugger. I try to make them a bit over the length of the hook shank in the case of a streamer or a woolly bugger. I then fix that in and try and get everything so that it's sitting on top of the fly, and wind forward, wrapping over the starting section of the marabou feather pieces, and then moving back along the body of the fly or towards the bend of the hook, and just thread wrap down until I get to the point where I figure, okay, that's going to be roughly where I'll end or start the tail of the fly. A couple of wraps around behind the marabou feather to fix it and keep it sort of sitting up nice and proud on top of the hook. Now that the tail's in place, tie in a length of copper wire. I have mine on a bobbin, just makes it easier to keep the wire in place and use the wire over time. So we'll fix that in. I hold it on an angle against the hook shank, do a couple of wraps around the tip, trap that in, and then start moving back along the body of the fly towards the bend of the hook. Finish that at the same place where you finished the wraps on your marabou tail feather. Then take your thread back forward again a little bit, I don't know, roughly to the middle of the fly. The next material to trap in is the chenille. So take a length of chenille, and I tend to take that length and start it at the front of the fly, roughly where I'm finishing the material for the fly itself before making the head. Trap the chenille in there and then wrap that, or thread wrap right along that, trapping the chenille in all the way along the body of the hook. Once again, try and get it so that it's sitting on top of the fly, and then once it's trapped in, back towards the middle of the fly and finish your thread there. Now that we have the chenille and wire in place, it's time to tie in the hackle. So take a piece of or a hackle feather. We want the barbs to be about twice the length of the gape of the hook. Pull off all of the fluffy pieces at the start of the feather. Get rid of those, they're just rubbish. I then like to actually pull all of the barbs along the length of the feather and separate them out, pull them back as much as I possibly can, holding the very tip of the feather. Once you've got those sort of pulled back and roughly to 90 degrees against the barb of the feather itself, just leaving a tiny little piece at the tip, tie in the tip into position, and once that's held in place, tie back to where you want to actually start wrapping the hackle in, and then move forward along the entire length of the hook shank, finishing your thread at the front of the fly, roughly where you're going to build the head of the fly itself. At this point, I like to put a whip finish knot in, just to hold the line in place while I move it out of the road. It's now time to build up the chenille body. So take your piece of chenille and using touching wraps, wrap that from the rear of the hook to the front of the hook, keeping the wraps close together so that you can build up a nice sort of even body for your fly. Once you've got to where you want to start the head of the fly, take your thread and do a wrap, a couple of wraps in front and then a wrap behind the length of chenille to trap it in place, and put a couple of wraps in behind to secure that, then a few more at the front and a few more behind, just so that you've got it held in place nice and securely. From there you can trim the chenille off. At this point I like to fix the thread in place again, so using my whip finish tool I just create another knot to hold the thread at that point, so that I can then start adding other materials to the body of the fly without having to worry about the thread. It's now time to add the hackle to the body. So move your thread out of the way, grab your piece of hackle. Now this takes a little bit of practice, but try and make sure that you're not trapping any of the feather, and keep them all the barbs at sort of 90 degrees. And then as you wrap forward, try not to twist the feather too much. It takes a bit of practice and it can be difficult, and move it forward along the body of the fly towards the head of the woolly bugger, leaving a bit of a gap between each wrap, and do about half a dozen or so wraps until you've got that hackle body covering the length of the fly right up to the head. Once you've got the feather at the head, you'll need to try and hold all of the the feather fronds back and get your thread and trap that feather in at the front of the fly. So to do that, you'll need to go behind the feather a couple of times and then holding as much of the feather back as you can, do a couple of wraps at the front, starting to sort of build up the head of your fly and to tidy it up a little bit, and cover up any sort of bits of feather that might have been trapped in there. You can then, with the feather nice and secure, rather than cutting it off, just slide the scissor along the feather and that will slice it out. Again, at this point I like to fix the thread in place, just using my whip finish tool. Just doing a little bit of clean up here to get rid of some of those feathers that have been trapped, or pieces of feather that have been trapped. Once I've done that, I'll just put a whip finish in and that will fix the thread into position so that I can then continue on with the remainder of the woolly bugger build. Okay, it's now time to secure the body with the length of wire that we've got attached. This is possibly the trickiest part of building the whole fly. What I like to do is try and make sure that I've got all of my my hackle feathers as straight as I can possibly get them, and then I'll try and wrap the wire, moving it, sort of wiggling it around and moving it forward in a nice even way towards the front of the fly with the wiggling, which helps you try and, or seems to allow you to trap less of the feather up against the body of the fly with the wire. I then will need to secure the wire in, so I take my thread and do a couple of wraps around behind the back of the wire and then in front again, and that will secure the wire in. When it comes to the wire, I like to try and secure it as much as I possibly can, so I get a little bit carried away probably with wrapping front and back behind the wire. I do that simply because it makes it a lot easier if the wire is trapped in nice and securely to actually break it off. To break it off, I just use a twisting motion. From here I build up the head of my fly just with some more thread to try and tidy it up, make sure I can't see any bit of hackle poking through, create a nice clean head with a few more thread wraps prior to finishing the fly. Then with my whip finish tool I'll secure the thread in place and do a couple of whip finish knots, and at this point we're just about done on the woolly bugger and we can cut our thread away. With the thread cut away, we can apply some head cement or glue, whatever you choose to use. I've just got a bit of hard as hull here, and I like to coat the head of the fly with this, just using the supplied brush. That will secure the thread and you kind of get a nice shiny head out of it as an end result as well. To complete the fly, I like to actually take a straw with a split in it and use this to kind of force the hackle back and give the fly a bit more of a streamlined look. So I'll just dip that in some water, or wet my fingers in water, coat the fly with a bit of water, and then slide the straw across the top of that. I'll then leave that for 10 minutes or so. You can take the fly out of the vise to do that, or you can leave it in there, it's up to you. You should find that the hackles have all sort of been pushed back and the fly's got a bit more of a streamlined look. I haven't really left it on long enough for this fly, so I'll just put it back on there and take the fly away from the vise, and I'm done. I can then start building another one. Thanks for watching Building a Woolly Bugger.